Nem nunca.
His foundation did something.
Olá a todos, bem-vindos à FLAD. Hello everyone, welcome to FLAD. It's a pleasure to welcome you here to hear Ugochukwu-Smooth Nzewi. More or less, sorry. I'll do best next time. 85, okay, it's not bad for a first try. It's not bad. I will train myself and I will be better next time, okay? And I will phone you. And we will train on the phone. Okay, so, sorry. It's a pleasure for FLAD to have you here and to hear Smooth, African art curator at MoMA, talk about this vision and this understanding of art. So I would now welcome Luís Campos Ferreira from Arte. Campos e Cunha, sorry. From Arte. Thank you, sorry.
Muito obrigado. Algumas pessoas saberão que eu sou o chairman da Arte 351, que tem as residências artísticas, e quando começámos, maybe I should talk in English. When we started, we wanted to have our residency organization and non-profit association to have several characteristics from the very beginning. And one of them was to be international. It's not to be national, then local market, and then no. Immediately we aim to be an international. And we had to show that. And the way to show that was in our jury of selection of artists to come to here. We have one American, one French, and one Portuguese. And what we call the strategic board, we wanted, which was basically an advisory board, we wanted to have foreign personalities with whom we talk now and then, and we have the opportunity to get some insights. Some of them come to Portugal, and then we meet them and we talk with them, and we get some suggestions. And one of the suggestions I was made was exactly Ugochukwu-Smooth Nzewi. Sorry, Nzewi. It was a suggestion, and we met in Basel some years ago, about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, 5 years ago. And we had a dinner, and I invited him to be part of the advisory board, the strategic board, as we call it. And he was kind enough to accept. After a nice conversation we had during dinner. At the time, I think he was still in the Dartmouth College, if I'm not wrong, and then moved to Cleveland Art Museum, and then more recently, in the last 3 years, just before the pandemic, he moved to MoMA, where he's a curator for the contemporary art of Africa, produced in Africa, let's say. And in that capacity, we invited Smooth to come here. There were several problems in between that had nothing to do with us, but life is what it is. FLAD was generous enough to sponsor his visit, and now you came here not to hear me, but to pay attention to what Smooth has to say, and thank you very much.
Hola. So that's how you say it, right? Hola. Okay. All right. Let me get this. All right, perfect. Good evening, everyone. First, my sincere thanks to FLAD and AIR 351 for the beautiful opportunity to be in Lisbon. I was just telling my friends over there that there's a way people shock you with warmth and hospitality that you begin to wonder what's going on. So that's been my experience since the last few days. And so yesterday I had wonderful studio visits with artists in residence at Arte 51, and I know a few of them are in the audience. Hello. In Cascais, I have also tried to learn how to say that, you know. And today I had a fantastic studio visit with Jose Pedro Croft, and I got to meet his son, and I got to see his work. It was really very fascinating to have that experience this morning. And so, like Luis said, this event has been long in the works, long in planning. We were first planned for me to visit in 2020. And due to COVID, we had to shift the date several times. The most recent was in July this year when I, 2 days to my leaving for Lisbon, I tested positive to COVID, and so we had to cancel it at the very last minute, you know. But I'm glad to be finally here. And I really want to thank Luis and Louisa of 351, Rita, Rui and Luz of Flad, and other members of the Flad team that I met today for persevering and not giving up on me, you know. And so what I'd like to talk about this evening is what I've called MoMA and Africa. It has become increasingly necessary to tell an expansive and more inclusive story of art and to bring attention to previously disregarded or underexplored narratives that enrich our knowledge of global art. And of course, this is where we tend to situate Africa. And so, as you may well be aware, there has been a shift toward greater representativity and inclusion in the art world, especially in the last 2 decades. And this shift has even become more radical in the last 5 years, with greater scrutiny of curatorial authority and the shape of art history that privileges the Western narrative. And so at MoMA, we have reimagined our collection galleries, expanding the stories that we tell, or broadening old storylines. And so, for example, one is the much talked about disruption on our 5th floor gallery, 506, when we reopened in October 2019. And that gallery focused on early Cubism. It was titled Around the Museu d'Avignon. And it's a gallery that was focused on the works of Picasso, but also included atypical works by artists such as Faith Ringgold, the African-American artist whose American People's Series number 20, Die, is an ambitious painting that was placed in dialogue with Picasso's Demoiselle. So this jarring placement of La Demoiselle and Picasso's painting from 1907 that evidences this early adaptation of so-called primitivism from Africa and oceanic art, and Ringgold's Die, created in 1967, in close proximity, disrupted how we had always told the story of 20th century modern art, and challenged also how we may otherwise consider artistic parallels or influences. And so bearing this disruption in mind, my talk addresses MoMA's history with African art and artists. And although Africa has been part of the story of MoMA from early on, it was for a different purpose, or rather, based on a different premise. And so what I will do is to walk you through this history of MoMA and Africa, beginning from how, where, and what, and when it began, and to where things stand presently, and hence the title of the talk, Looking Back to Move Forward. In 1935, MoMA organized African Negro Arts, curated by James Johnson Sweeney, a preeminent American critic and art historian of modern art, and a MoMA curator from 1935 to 1946. African Negro Art was MoMA's first African art show, and was presented as the largest loan exhibition in the world at that time. It featured about 600 objects that were mainly masks and sculptures from West and Central Africa. Sweeney's curatorial approach was devoid of chronological or geographical consideration. Instead, he was focused on the object's plastic qualities as a source of inspiration for European avant-garde artists such as Derain and Matisse, who were early collectors of some of these objects included in the show. And so the exhibition could have been considered groundbreaking at that time, but it also revealed the colonial mindset that underpinned the earlier fixation with non-Western objects, especially African art. As art historian, Jack Flam reminds us in Primitivism and 20th Century Art, this interest in aestheticizing so-called primitive art was part of an epistemological assimilation and co-optation of the so-called orders, meaning people or cultures in the non-Western context. 17 years later, MoMA staged its next African show titled Understanding African Negro Sculpture. The 1952 exhibition was not at the scale of its 1935 predecessor. It was small, but it recalled the themes from 1935. It was more focused and included 32 enlarged camera studies of African objects, as you can see on the slide, by the American documentary photographer Elliot Elissophon, who had spent considerable time working in Africa for Life magazine. Other exhibitions about African art at MoMA were the little-known African Textiles and Decorative Art Show in 1972, which you see on the left of the far left, and the very important but controversial Primitivism in 20th Century Art in 1984, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. But in all these instances, the African art shown was a canonical variety of tradition-based art forms, and the emphasis was the role of those objects in changing the course of Western art in the 20th century. By 1960, MoMA pivoted to modern art by African artists, beginning with the work of Sam Ntiro, the late Tanzanian modernist and diplomat. Ntiro trained in the arts program at Makerere University in Uganda and subsequently at Slade School of Fine Art in London. In 1956, Ntiro held his first solo exhibition at the iconic but defunct Merton Simpson Gallery, New York, that included the painting, the 1956 painting, Men Taking Banana to Bride by Night, which you see on the screen, where our pioneer director, Alfred Barr, saw the work and purchased it for the museum. So this was the first work of modern art by an African artist to join the MoMA's collection. And so what you see is a work composed of flowing, wave-like brush strokes that depicts a prospective son-in-law and relatives with jars of the traditionally brewed beer walking through a dense rural landscape on their way to the bride's home. And like many modernist pioneers in Africa of that era, Ntiro attempts a synthesis of local traditions and colonial modernity. And then the image on the right is an installation show of the work in company of other works when it entered the MoMA collection in the late 1960s. It's typically in the past, whenever MoMA made acquisitions, it would stage an exhibition of recent acquisitions. And this was part of that show at that time, and it was never shown again. In 1962, Alfred Barr, our pioneer director, visited Africa for the first time. The occasion was the first International Congress of African Culture, organized by Frank McEwen, the director of what was then called Rhodes National Gallery in Salisbury, now the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, in present-day Harare. I tend to think of Frank McEwen as the Hans Ulbricht of this era. He was someone who was well-wired in the art world, well-known. And the main purpose of ICAC, which was inspired by events that happened in Paris and Rome early on, and which was held from August 1 to September 30th, 1962, was to explore the significance of African cultures and arts through displays of classical and modern art by African and non-African artists, Instructively, that event in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia at that time, marked the beginnings of MoMA's formal relationship with Africa. And so, on the left, you find Alfred Barr speaking at the event, and on the right is a slew of international participants at that event, and some of those who were there included Tasanta Sara, Bill Fagg, as well as African modernists like Kofi Antabam from Ghana, as well as others. And here I show you an installation shot of one of the exhibitions display at that event. It also included an exhibition that had 3 or 4 different exhibitions. One focused on classical African art, one focused on modern African art, one focused on European art in dialogue with traditional African art, and then another focused on musical instruments. So the direct outcome of Barr's trip to Southern Rhodesia was the acquisition of works by Zimbabwean artists, such as Thomas Mukarobwa, whose vibrant modernist primitivist paintings, Dying People in the Bush and River Coming from the Bush, both from 1962, are on the left of the slide. Another key purchase that followed in this period was the Mosque in 1964 painting by the Sudanese artist Ibrahim El-Salahi, who's really become well entrenched in the art world. And this was acquired during El-Salahi's residency in New York in the mid-1960s. And what you find in this remarkable painting by El-Salahi is his masterly graphic and linear style that combines abstraction, compact and sinuous figures, a dichromatic color palette, and calligraphic forms. And on the far right is Bar, MoMA's director then, and El-Salahi, walking through MoMA's, one of our galleries during El-Salahi's time in New York. So the 1960s was a foundational moment in the acquisition of works by African artists at MoMA. But then the interest in Africa cooled off in the 1970s and 1980s. It would resume again in the 2000s and have since gathered momentum. In 2016 and 2017, the museum acquired important drawings by the Nigerian modernist Ugochukwu, and also, after acquiring a painting by El-Salahi in the 1960s, acquired the very important prison notebook from 1976 by Ibrahim El-Salahi. It's really a very major work by El-Salahi that details his experience during the military dictatorship in Sudan. He was the art advisor to the government, and when there was a regime change in the early 1970s, he was thrown into jail. And so in that moment he was in jail, he was making those very haunting drawings about that experience, and was able to compile that. And MoMA acquired the suite of drawings, 38 works on paper, in, I think we acquired it in 2017. In April 2019, shortly before I arrived at MoMA, the museum received an extraordinary gift of 45 artworks from the Jean Pigozzi African Arts Collection in Geneva. Jean Pigozzi is a French, Italian, Swiss collector who claims he has the biggest collection of African art. But this gift has significantly transformed MoMA's holdings of works by African artists, and it includes works by well-known Congolese artists such as Bodi Kingiles, who was the subject of a monographic show in 2018, which I will discuss subsequently, Sherry Samba, Ambroise Ngaimoko, and Moke. Now, since my arrival, we have added a number of high-profile works by major modernist and contemporary artists, and I want to say that my colleague, Nancy Dantas, has been part of this attempt in bringing in these works into the collection. At the top right is the work of it's Cry Freedom or Cry for Freedom, a major 1973 painting by the celebrated Mozambican painter Valentin Malangatana, who is well known in Portugal, that addresses Mozambique's struggle for political independence. Following Malangatana is Ugochukwu, whose drawings I showed in the previous slide. And this is a work titled Women Riot, a 1965 painting by Ugochukwu that memorializes a 1929 protest by women of eastern Nigeria against the imposition of taxes by British colonial administration. That event of 1929 is often tied to the collapse of Wall Street in October of 1929. And for that reason, because Wall Street collapsed, countries with colonial holdings began to were looking to expand their tax bases. And women who were not taxed before in Africa became the casualty of that event. And so women in eastern Nigeria protested following that imposition. And it's described as the first instance of a feminist push against colonial authority anywhere in Africa. So Ugochukwu becomes this first artist to attempt to monumentalize this event. And here you see this fiery-looking women sort of trying to confront the viewer in the process of staging this protest. Completing the works at the top half of the slide is Walking the Bird, an incomparable 1971 painting by Egyptian-born, New York-based surrealist artist Ahmed Morsi. Now, the two paintings on the bottom half, Fortune Teller, an incredible 1959 work by the influential Egyptian artist Ghazia Siri, whose career spans key phases of modern Egyptian art from the 1940s until when she passed away last year. And Untitled by Sudanese artist Kamala Ishag, a preeminent woman artist of Africa, and the subject of a monographic exhibition that opened last month at London's Serpentine Gallery. So I was in London roughly 3 weeks ago to see that show. It's a very well produced exhibition and celebrates her contributions to the development of modern art in Africa in the last 60-odd years. And so a major thrust of our current effort is to build upon foundational acquisitions of the 1960s, which is what you see here, the works you see here. Our attempt is to, because MoMA started with a focus in the mid-century Africa, we started by trying to build upon that, what MoMA did previously. And the reason is that the mid-century is a very crucial period of African modernism, defined by the emergence of independent countries in Africa, and with artists responding to the demands of a new avant-garde art that recognized the aspirations of national rebirth and decolonization. But I've also been making strategic acquisitions to address other time periods. And so on the left of this slide is Theo Eshetu, the British Ethiopian artist Theo Eshetu's Till Death Us Do Part, a 1980s video work, which arguably is the first video work by an artist of African origins. And the work comprises 20 monitors, 2 small gold-painted masks, and a single church pew that you don't see on this slide. And Eshetu is one of the first artists to actually explore the video wall when that technology emerged in the early 1980s. And then on the right is Untitled, a diptych painting from 1988 by South African-born Oxford-based Gavin Yantes, who was very active in the British art scene in the 1980s. Something quite interesting is that Yantes he was living in Germany, and when he moved to the UK in the early 80s, he shared the same galleries with Paula Rega. Yeah. And so at that time, and so this is a work that is from a key group of paintings and drawings that Yantes executed between 86 and 1990. And his research at that time concerned what he calls the reciprocity of cultures and creation myths from across Africa as it sought a new interpretive lens for engaging influential 20th century art styles. And so, of course, you will see the image of the African mask, which is really a totem for Cubism, you know. And so he was interested in that relationship. But unlike the early period of MoMA, where the exhibitions that I initially showed you were interested in thinking about how Africa, how non-Western art, the so-called primitivist art, how Western artists were drawing from those ideas to sort of re-energize their art. For Gavin Yantis, it was more interested in how cultures, how people borrow from cultures, you know, as a way of sort of leveling that field. And here I show you some other works from the 1990s to the 2000s, again, where we've been collecting from the mid-century to the present. And at the top right is a very important work titled Homage to the Hunters of Mande from 1995 by the Malian artist Abdoulaye Konate. The textile-based installation combines ancient textile tradition of Mali called the Bogolan Fini, which is really a mud-dyed cotton fabric, and assorted materials, including leather pouches, carefully arranged in rows, together with multicolored dangling wool yarns that complement the brown and black leather pouches, and the white cowrie shells that take the form of geometric charts and schematic human forms. I don't know if you're able to make out those forms here that sort of, you see those diagrams made out of cowrie shells. And for him, it's really about thinking about how the tradition can inspire contemporary practice. And then the abstract painting on the top right is titled Vertigo 2 from 2012. It's by the Ivorian artist Ouattara Watts, who was really very prominent in New York in the late 80s, early 90s, because of his relationship with Jean-Michel Basquiat. And this is actually the first acquisition I made when I arrived at MoMA. And it's a work composed of 3 large color fields of off-white green and off-white applied fabric, and 3 coffee bags are arrayed horizontally on the green area. And it's a work that reflects Watt's interest in cosmogony, spiritualism, literature, politics, and music. And at the bottom is a work titled, in my language, Akpo Honabo, Ntutuko, Onyap Abunibe, and I'll explain what this means. It basically means 2 buttocks rubbing together, may each not deprive the other of space. It's a philosophical statement of live and let's live, you know, and it's by the Nigerian artist Ugochukwu, who currently lives in LA. It was a work commissioned for the Savai Biennial in 2006. And this is the most ambitious drawing by Ugochukwu, comprised of 2 large panels, each composed of 8 3 by 22 inch sheets and 4 15 by 22 inch sheets arranged in a grid, with each individual sheet also able to stand as a separate drawing. Together, they form 2 large buttocks rendered in black and white, positive and negative, from which the work derives its title. And so what we've also ensured is that once we make these acquisitions, we want them to immediately go out into our collection galleries. We don't put them away in the storage. And so here I show you Kamalai Shag's Untitled, anchoring one of our 4th floor galleries titled Body on the Line. And that gallery features key women artists from the early 1970s, from 1970s through the early 1980s, such as the American artist Hannah Wilkie, the Brazilian artist Annabella Geiger, whose video you see there, the video work there. And I mean, this is Wilkie's work, Anna Wilkie, Geiger. This is Anna Mendieta's sculpture. And then these are drawings by Kamalai Shag. And so all these works address feminism and femininity in the 1970s and 1980s. I've also had the pleasure of installing Gallery 206 on the second floor. It's a gallery titled The Sum of All Parts, and it gathers works from the 1980s that invoke the human body, both as a physical entity, but also as a complex symbolic terrain to address matters of self-enlightenment, trauma, anti-racism, and social justice. And on the slide, you see Tio Shetu's Till Death Do Us Part. And now you can see the pew that was missing in the previous image I showed you. And it's alongside the work of An Untitled by Kiki Smith, a major work by Kiki Smith from the 1980s. And then, of course, Adrienne Piper's work at the far end, What Become of Me. And here I show you Ugochukwu's work, Akpo Nabo. It was acquired last fall, and it's currently on view in Gallery 2015 titled Unstable Ground. And this gallery is installed by my curatorial colleagues, Lanka Tatastral and Paulina Popoha. And I wanted to share a close-up of Ugochukwu's work and even the detail of the work. It's really it's an extraordinary drawing that offers a detailed array of pictorial and textural elements, from narratives to poetry to calligraphic symbols and figures to washi abstraction, all floating or merging in rhythmic cadence. But besides making important acquisitions to amplify the presence of African artists at MoMA, we have set for ourselves the task of addressing Africa's robust contributions to global modernism that is not always acknowledged. Exhibitions, both thematic and monographic, are central to this undertaking. But MoMA actually began to do this before my time. And so in 2002, for example, MoMA PS1, the other MoMA in Queens, hosted the traveling exhibition, The Short Century, Independence and Liberation Movements in Africa, 1945 to 1994, curated by the late Okwe Enweze. And one would argue that this is the most important exhibition of the last 20 years on African culture, art, and history. Through art, film, music, photography, architecture, literature, and theater, the exhibition mapped Africa's 20th century, beginning with the intensification of anti-colonial agitations following the Second World War, and ending with the emergence of democracy in South Africa in 1994. And so with this exhibition, Enweze created a living archive of African history, which until that moment had been absent. He also highlighted mutual histories and linked narratives and Africa's place within a global network. In 2011, MoMA originated its first African thematic exhibition. So the show in the previous slide was a touring show that came to us. But in 2011, we organized our first African show, Impressions from South Africa, in 1965 to now, which focused on South African art and explored the various printing techniques used in South Africa since the 1960s. But it also looked at the impact of printmaking to the political struggle against apartheid in South Africa, but also how the practice of printmaking has since evolved in post-apartheid South Africa. And so what you would see in that exhibition was different generations of printmakers from South Africa, from 1965 really to 2011 at that time. In 2018, my colleague Sarah Suzuki organized a well-received body Kingile's City Dreams. I did mention this previously. City Dreams has the distinction of being MoMA's first monographic exhibition devoted to a Black African-born artist. It featured about 30 incredible architectural maquets by this Congolese artist Kingile's, providing a comprehensive account of the artist's work from early single structures, dazzling, sprawling cities, and to futuristic late works. The Congolese sculptor who passed away in 2015 was known for his ambitious models of fictive cities made of cardboard, paper tape, and found materials. And so if you were in the show, you would see some of the works rotating slowly on turntables, while others are reflected in mirrors from above, as you can see on this. But I am deeply committed to ensuring that Africa remains an integral part of MoMA's program through rich and historically significant exhibitions that continually complicate and enrich the presentation of modern and contemporary art. And so this year, I organized World Unbound, an exhibition devoted to the late Ivorian artist Frederic Brulé-Boisbré, a giant of 20th century art who enjoyed tremendous international success and recognition since participating in Magicien de la Terre in Paris in 1989. And I'm glad that there are a few people in the audience who saw that exhibition in New York, so I'm happy. But this exhibition was the first major survey of this visionary artist in the United States and the first monograph of a West African artist at MoMA. So the work of Frederic Brulé-Boisbré had a single objective: to record and transmit information about the known universe. Devoting his life to a quest for knowledge, Boisbré captured and codified subjects from a range of sources, including his native traditions, folklore, religious and spiritual belief systems, philosophy, and popular culture. And so the exhibition gathered key and rarely seen drawings and manuscripts from across Boisbré's decades-long prolific career from the 1970s to until 2011, including the alphabet beta, which I'm not showing you here, the artist's invention of the first writing system for the better people of Côte d'Ivoire, to which he belonged. So finally, I'm going to wrap up now. We are working on a new ambitious exhibition project and publication that would bring together some of the recent acquisitions that I've shown you from the mid-century. We are in the very beginning of the research phase of that exhibition, so I'll be very careful on what I say here. You know? So, but the exhibition is tentatively titled Freedom and Futures, and aims to present a precise yet comprehensive artist-centered history of modernism in Africa during the key years of political independence from 1956 to about 1982. And so with the exhibition, we propose the term emancipatory modernism as a new framework for understanding the aspirational rhetoric of political and cultural liberation in that period and the varying strategies that artists adopted towards that goal. And so the way we're thinking about the exhibition, it will unfold two parallel but connected stories of national and transnational modernisms. And this is because modernist art in Africa in this period emerged from the intersection of politics and cultural nationalism and generated intense dialogue about collective solidarity. And in that period, transnational exchanges happened through landmark congresses, festivals, and conferences that took place between 1956 and 1982 in France, Italy, Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, Senegal, Algeria, Nigeria, and Botswana. And so Freedom and Future will represent key exhibitions of modern art accompanying this event, as indicated on this slide, which for the first time will attempt to unite works by African and African diasporic artists. But at the same time, the Freedom and Future will examine the conditions of artistic practices in the various African countries that hosted or were subjects of these important gatherings. And so, as I said, the relationship between the national and transnational in African modernism is a history that has not yet been told in depth and at the scale we're imagining for this show. And I'm really, really excited about this exhibition that we hope will ultimately shift the understanding of global modernism and Africa's place in that conversation. Thank you for listening.
Just a quick question. Thank you very much for your talk. I learned a lot. Thank you. What's the exhibition in 1966, 76 in LA, Los Angeles County Museum, 2 centuries of Black American art. What kind of impact did it have in MoMA? Did it go to New York? I don't know if this exhibition moved around in the United States. Did it change in any way the thought on African art?
Yeah, so I know they show, it was organized by Jeff Donaldson, who was a professor at Howard University at that time. It's called 200 Years of African American Art. I think one of the things that exhibition did was that it sort of drew a lot of attention to a history of Black art in the United States that was not recognized up until that time. You know, so this was the first attempt to really gather, the first attempt to begin to construct that history. And the way I'll respond to that question is the story, an Ethiopian American friend of mine who's a collector, but also she used to be a dealer, told me she was then a student. She had just arrived at the United States from Ethiopia. And that exhibition was an introduction to art history. That exhibition was an introduction to collecting. You know, that exhibition was an introduction to what she now knows about American art history, but from an African American perspective. It was really a groundbreaking exhibition. The subsequent exhibitions on Black art sort of looked to as a sort of a source of inspiration or direction. But did it impact MoMA? I don't think so. You know, up until quite recently, which is one of the things I was trying to draw attention to prior to the 1990s, when we thought about the international, when we thought about mainstream art. You know, we're basically talking about Paris, French, Germany, and the United States. You know, that was sort of the way in which MoMA constructed its art history, and that art history sort of filtered down and ordered how we approached 20th century art. You know, so what Jeff Donaldson tried to do at that time was to establish sort of a counter narrative, a counter narration to the way in which art history was produced at that time, which MoMA began to do several decades later. So it was an exhibition that was sort of a pathfinder. Other questions?
Hi. So I have a question not directly to have to do with MoMA, because it's an issue that I think doesn't address MoMA's collection, but you know this, I would like to know your views and your position on this more recent movement about restitution of African art. I know it's a controversial issue, that's why it's interesting. From several museums in Europe and also in the United States that have very important pieces of the history of African art and all this process of and the discussion of restitution. So I would like to hear your view.
My view.
Your personal view.
Yes, I'll give you my personal view.
I know.
So I would have given you a different answer, but then the answer I'll give you is now inspired by my conversation with Louis today, when he was talking about, so we had this conversation about how Lisbon changed after the earthquake of the 1755, followed by a tsunami, and then followed by a fire, and then followed by the other heartbreak, which was the looting of Portuguese collection. You know, it was a trade-off between the British colonizers and then the French. This is a history that I didn't know, but it was very fascinating for me, because when Luis was telling me that story, I could see his passion and nationalism when he was telling me that part of the story, you know, how that piece of history, we cannot recover that history. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So I could feel his passion when he said, it's a history that is forgotten. You know, how can we recover that history? You know, it's not in the archives, it's not in the public memory, it's not even in the, well, it's in few imaginations, you know, for those who are invested in that sort of history. And so one would tend to think about restitution in that way. So when Savoy and Sarr, Louis Sarr, the Senegalese political scientist, and Benedict Savoy, the French-born, German-based art historian, were commissioned by Macron to put together that document. You know, there's something that Sarr stresses, you know, the way in which those objects in themselves hold ancestral memory that are absent from the continent, and how it's important for younger generations to be able to connect to that ancestral memory by looking at physical objects. You know, of course, I had a different perspective. I mean, we had a conference at Columbia University in 2019 to discuss that report. You know, and so I had a different response to that. And my response was basically that communities, I mean, ancestral memories do not always reside in tangible forms, but of course it does. But where it stays and where it continues to mutate is in the intangible forms, you know, so like music, like dance, because those objects in themselves, they were dormant objects until they were activated. And how do you activate those objects? You activate them with music, with dance, and all of that, you know. So that was my response then. But having listened to Louis today, showing so much passion about the absence of history and memory, you know, you could think about why it's important, as Felwyn and Benedict argued in their report. But I think the larger issue for me really is what would become of those objects when they are restituted. You know, there's a couple of things. You know, the objects left, and when they return, they're different objects altogether. Now the question is, in what way are you going to re-narrate and reintegrate those objects into society? First, they won't go back to the cultures in which they were removed from, either forcefully or unforcefully, you know. And so that is a larger question for me. So in what ways can, for emerging generations or younger generations who are not quite familiar, who do not know that history, how are you able to bring that history alive for them? And I don't think the current conversations around restitution is really addressing that. I mean, I think it's more about let's return those objects, which is a valid point, you know. But I think what becomes of those objects is not fully taken into account. And I say this because I did at the restitution conference at Columbia University, I used the work of Theo Eshetu, who I presented here. Another work by Theo Eshetu, the British Ethiopian artist. It's called Return of the Axum Obelisk. It's a work he produced in 2012, where he sort of followed the return of this obelisk that Italy took away from Ethiopia when they fought the war in I think in the early 20th century, you know. And so that obelisk, which stayed right in front of the FAO, the United Nations Food Organization in Rome for many years, and no one knew what it was, you know. But then there was also always a movement by Ethiopians to get that obelisk returned as a symbol of Ethiopian nationalism, but also religious nationalism. And so by 2012, actually, I think, I don't remember my dates, but it was returned. And so Theo followed the process of taking that object, the obelisk, back to Axum. Now, the question was, when it arrived in Axum, you know, it became, the the priest of the Orthodox Church came, and then it was a question of how do we reintegrate the obelisk into Ethiopia, because it can no longer do what it was doing prior to its flight from Ethiopia. And I think these are some of the things that I don't think we've really fully addressed. And I think there's, I'm interested in that. How can we really think about, it's not just only about returning or restituting the objects, which I know it's valid, but how then do we make visible the kinds of conversations those objects upon their return can offer the community? How can we produce those sort of conversations without just putting the objects away in storage? Did I answer your question? Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Smooth, for your presentation. And just a small parenthesis, just clarify, the loot that was mentioned to you was after the Napoleonic invasion of when Junot took control of Lisbon. And the way to avoid the British to have a fight, which is in cities always complicated. He decided, okay, we go away, but then we take the loot. And they did loot the Lisbon, what was left from the fire, and the fire burned down the archive of the king in 1755. So in the collection of the king had an art collection that burned down. We don't even know what exactly was in it. We know only it existed because of indirect references.
Right.
John V. The collection was made by John V. Now, I have a small collection, or a small question, which is, as far as I understand nowadays, African art is very much trendy now. Everyone wants to, and we see a little bit everywhere in art galleries and so on. So there is a kind of, probably overshooting now of African artists, contemporary, I'm talking about contemporary African artists. How do you see that trend? I mean, how do you see that? What is your opinion on that?
Do you have African contemporary art in your collection?
You will see that.
Okay.
I have.
So why did you collect it?
Because I enjoyed the piece that I saw it, I could afford it.
Okay. So long may the trend leave. Anyway, I'll answer your question. I was just checking with you. So how do I see that trend? They've been, so when you look at, so I would say, part of the reason I'm fascinated with the 1960s and 70s as this period of flourish for modern African art is in that at that time there was also a similar kind of interest in contemporary, what was then contemporary African art, because it reflected national rebirth and aspiration for political independence, and so the vocabulary captured the zeitgeist of that moment, across the continent, So there was this attempt to say, okay, this is how we want to represent ourselves as a modern culture, with works that, of course, capture some of that drew from the European academic style, but then with a slant that sort of reflected how people wanted to see themselves as modern people. So there was that interest at that time, So there were exhibitions in Europe, There were also exhibitions in the United States dealing with what was seen as an emerging trend, you know. Malangatana would have his shows then here, but also in London. And then something happened in the 80s, you know. I mean, when I was talking about MoMA in the 80s, MoMA stopped collecting African art actually from the 70s, you know. But then in the 80s, I mean, there are a couple of reasons I would argue for what happened to happen. So on the political front, there was no longer use of culture in the Cold War, because what was happening in the 60s and 70s was it was a justin between the U.S. and the old Soviet Union, and so cultural diplomacy was one of the weapons of the Cold War, and so it was important to be interested in works of other cultures, the modern works of other cultures, be it visual art but also literature. But then also what began to happen from the 70s was, and I'm taking you on a history now, you know, what began to happen in the 70s was the emergence of what people will call salvage anthropology in scholarship or in the academia, you know, where this idea of we want to recover, that this push to modern society in non-Western culture means that tradition is dying. You know, suddenly you began to see a refocus on canonical forms in African art, you know, that inspired 20th century modern art. And then the market began to get bigger, you know, no one was paying attention to works by African or black artists in general. I mean, in the UK context, artists like Frank Bolan, who were part of the emerging international landscape of abstract art, they began to see themselves being shoved into ghettos of black art. So suddenly the category of black art emerged, and they had to develop in the UK black galleries. That wasn't there in the 60s, you know, black galleries to cater to black British artists from the Caribbean and from Africa, you know, because there was that absence of interest. So the trend sort of seemed to die. Then in the 1990s, with globalization, there was a different wave of interest, you know, and then that interest had continued to grow. You know, my point is that there have been moments since the mid-century where African, modern and contemporary African art was seen as the flavor of the month, you know, and it would happen, it will quiet down, and then it will reemerge again with more force, you know. But what has been happening in the last, I mean, it started off in the 90s and then began to, it's become fully established now, I would say, is just that notions of diversity and equity became even better established in the art world, you know. And so, for example, if I'm at MoMA because the art world shifted, you know, and now MoMA would want to place works of black and African artists in MoMA, you know, and the market responds to that. And as you pointed out, it's still cheaper to buy the works of African artists than to buy the works of the Western contemporaries, with the sense that it will improve in value the next day, you know.
Well, African artists are getting very expensive.
Which is a good thing.
Hello, can I ask a question?
Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm curious about this last show that you've introduced, and I wonder, is it going to be a show more focused on exhibition histories and tracing back within the time frame that you've defined a kind of archival approach to the exhibition, or is it going to integrate as well artworks or restage aspects of what had been shown previously in those contexts that you've highlighted in the slide?
Yeah, I think you got it. It's
so it's both.
It's a bit of everything. So it's going to be so those exhibitions that happened in that period, aspects of those exhibitions will be restaged, you know, because it's important to really to foreground the significance of those historical exhibitions that have not been quite addressed. You know, that's how we construct art history. But at the same time, the countries that hosted those events, there would be a fulsome focus on the national modernisms of those countries, because, as I explained, how I understand, or how I think art history has written about that period, is that it was at the conjunction of national and the transnational for one to really understand what happened in the 1960s in Africa, because people were invested in the rhetorics of liberation. You know, that was what defined that period, and decolonization. And so you had ideas of collective solidarity that went across national borders, but informed what happened within national borders. You know, so what the exhibition is trying to do, or will attempt to do, is to be able to present a true picture of how things unfolded in that period, you know.
And do you think there's a tension between presenting works that are very much drawn from processes and from making in a kind of collective mode, and how that is translated into the gallery space? I'm just thinking of 7 Stories of Modern Art in Africa, for example, at Whitechapel Gallery.
Well, it was, I mean, 7 Stories is a totally different, we can't go into the criticism of exhibitions,
I
you know,
know,
but it's a totally
I'm just
different.
curious to know how you will deal with process.
Well, one of the things, so I mean, your question is really very, 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 very important question. I mean, what 7 Stories did was to subjectively arrive at telling histories of modern art in few selected African countries. You know, Senegal, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia. I think that's about that, you know. And part of the reason why they did that is to look at sort of the establishment of art schools, and how those art schools inform the trajectory of artistic practice in those countries, you know. Or in the case of South Africa or Kenya, you know, where the absence of art school, where there were absence of formal art school for black artists, but where there was a certain tradition of making that continues to inform the landscape of artistic practice in those countries, you know. So it was trying to tell those stories, you know, and so what informed decisions made was countries with well-articulated formal art schools, and then countries that have long-standing tradition of making, but outside of the art schools, you know. Now, what this show is trying to do, and that's where the idea of trying to look at this historical event, because you can't make a show of Africa, you know. I mean, I said MoMA and Africa, but it's really something that I avoid saying, because Africa is a big continent, and very often than not, we tend to think of, when we make shows, thematic shows on Africa, we make Africa a country. And so for me, it becomes important for the purpose of this show to think art historically, or to think historically about countries that were very active in thinking through what liberation meant through visual art in that period, you know. So the countries we're looking at offer different models of how to understand what we've called emancipatory modernism. So for example, now I'm saying things I shouldn't say because the exhibition is still in the works, you know, you're getting me to talk. For instance, in Zimbabwe, Southern Rhodesia at that time was under what you would call settler colonialism. You know, Frank McEwen was obviously he was British French, but was a pioneer director of the National Gallery there, you know. He was, I don't know, but I mean, I would think that his politics was anti-colonial, you know. But he also had a sense of what he wanted artists to make so there was this paternalistic relationship he had with artists in that period that sort of helped generate a certain kind of modernism in Zimbabwe. So I'm interested in that kind of modernism as a model of how one can think about the rhetorics of emancipation in that period. In Senegal, for instance, Léopold Sédar Senghor, who we may be familiar with, who was one of the co-directors of the Negritude movement, which was inspired by Surrealism, was the president of Senegal, and his approach. He was a poet. He loved art. He was friends with Picasso, Braque, and others, you know. And he thought about a modern art that was directed by the state. So when you go to Senegal, you have a state-led approach to the establishment of a modernist art in Senegal. And then you go to Algeria in that time, that following their harrowing experience with France after the war, had a very socialist approach to nation building, which was reflected in the art of artists who emerged in the 1960s, the so-called generation of the 30s, became the standard bearers of the kinds of cultural politics that the government of Algeria was invested in the 1960s, you know. And so you have a socialist revolutionary kind of practice around how one is thinking about emancipatory modernism that Algeria offers you. And then in Nigeria, the history of art in Nigeria has always been created by patrons and artists with no state intervention, really, you know. And so it offers you a different model where the emergence of the landscape of modern art in Nigeria was between private patrons and artists. And then in South Africa, it offers you a different model altogether, because there's a longer history of settler colonialism in South Africa, you know. But then in South Africa was the moment where artists began to think of themselves as cultural workers, invested in the struggle for liberation, you know. So that is really, so the exhibition itself takes its impetus from the theme and the historical situatedness of that theme in the mid-century through the early 80s. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you.